Alright, as the year is coming to a close, we're going to talk about two new releases here, and then we'll talk about two other new releases pretty much right after this. So, to start off, I guess we'll go with The Matrix Resurrections, which was another one of those movies that was, of course, a long-delayed sequel to a movie that I really the first one, obviously, is something that I really love, and has always been one of my relatively favorite movies. And then I remember the other two coming out like 6 months apart, and the hype behind that, and being at the theater when I was like 12 or 13 in between. And it was just a really exciting time. And there was one of those cases also where it was like I was still young enough where if a movie that had a lot of hype was going to be disappointing, it's something that I wouldn't really realize yet until later on, or could really think about it more. So I do remember how much I loved Reloaded in the theater, and I still like Reloaded, even though obviously, it's the two sequels obviously didn't get a whole lot of love when you compare it to the first one. They're still the fans are out. They're out there and they exist for sure. But for the most part, people seem to look down on the sequels. Even some of the newer cast kind of like felt like they were like throwing some shade at them during recent interviews for this one, which almost seemed kind of, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's honest, but I don't know if I would do that. Especially since if I was still working with like Lana Wachowski and stuff like that, and promoting this. But and there's cases where it's like, how much do they have room to talk, depending on how you feel about this. But as far as Revolutions goes, Revolutions was the one that seems to get has less people that love it than Reloaded does. And the thing about Revolutions is that I don't really remember much. I think I've maybe seen it twice. And one of those times was the theater, and the only thing that I really think of when I think of it is like the climax and then the ending. Like, I couldn't tell you pretty much anything that came before that, like the hour and 40 minutes before that. So that's pretty much where I stand with these. But obviously, I know the first one front to back, and I just saw it again when they re-released it in theaters a couple of weeks ago, which was my first time seeing it in a theater. And it's just amazing as it's ever been. Which may or may not have been doing this one favors by giving the original a re-release leading up to this. But yeah, so as far as it going in, they were talking about the idea of it being like a meta experience. And I wasn't quite sure exactly how they were going to go about that, even though it seems obvious in retrospect now. Yeah, I really had no idea just how much they were. Like, I wasn't really quite sure what they were going to do, but then now that I've seen it, I really would have never guessed just how meta they really went. But I could see the whole concept being off-putting right away. The whole idea of like the trilogy being just like a video game that Thomas Anderson created, and then there's the question of, is he still in the simulation or is this the real world, and all that stuff. I I was surprised by how immediate I was. Kind of like, all right, let's see what they're going to do with this, and let's see where it goes. I mean, there's only one direction it can go. Like, it's only, you're going to be, asking these questions for not very long before it's like, well, I mean, if it's not this particular scenario, then what's the movie going to be? So it doesn't have like as many secrets that you're hoping to unlock as the movie goes on. You'll see a lot of it coming pretty quickly, but as far as like how it captures the feeling of, and it's one of those cases where it almost seems unfair to go into a movie like this and like when you're expecting the absolute quality of something like the original or something, or even at the very least the best parts of Reloaded or Revolutions or whatever. It's the bar kind of gets so high that it's not. That's the thing though, is like you can say that that's unfair, but at the same time, it is kind of incredible how generic a lot of this movie feels, because you have a lot of action that goes on in it, especially as we're kind of getting towards the end. One might almost think there's not enough action in it, depending on what you're looking for, what you're looking to get out of this, and what it is that they're doing with the concept exactly. But you would think that, like, and I know another problem that I've always brought up is the idea of if you try to be, like, super iconic, you're probably going to fail and you're not going to reach that. Things that become iconic almost seem to by accident, where it's just a filmmaker making something that they really want to make, and then if it takes off, it takes off. So now you got the lone Lana Wachowski stuck in this place where it's like, are you just gonna make the movie that you feel like you need to make? Which we can talk about that also. But when you go into these action scenes, now you're tasked with the idea of I've got to make something like as big and something that's gonna stick in people's minds as much. But it almost kind of feels like that thought never really happened because the fight sequences are so generic and so far away from anything that could be remotely seen as iconic down the road. And I know sometimes even that line is blurry, where something might not seem iconic in the moment, but then years down the road suddenly, something will just kind of find that spark. But I don't think any of that is going to be found here. There's one part of the climatic action scene that's pretty wild, but I don't know if that's nothing's going to kind of give the feel again. That you had, like I said, you don't even have to set the bar as high as the original movie. Just talk about, like, the best stuff in Reloaded or something. Was like the bar that you would maybe want to reach to basically give your audience the idea that this movie had a purpose for existing. Is basically what the battle is. And while it does open up these new ideas, it does feel very there's a lot of dialogue that seems like it's talking directly out of the screen and directly to you, the audience, who have been talking about the original movies for however long they've been out. And so there's this whole talk about, taking the pills or not taking the pills. And one character says, like, even dissecting that is missing the point entirely. And it's like you can sense that it's like almost trying to lash out at criticism that it's received before. Which can be a bit off-putting, but then there's also the weird thing where, like, meta in general, just the whole concept of being meta in general seems to be like, embrace your reputation as it is and then run with it from there. So it's like this sort of clashing thing there where it's like, are you running with this or are you lashing out at the criticism, or which one of these are you doing and which one of these are you embracing? Because it seems to kind of go back and forth between those things, which can be quite make everything kind of fuzzy in regards to what exactly this is trying to do or what it wants to be. But then there's a whole other thing where I was talking about, Lana Wachowski pretty much doing this solo, without her sister at least. There were a couple of co-writers, but even so, there was the whole idea of how did this movie even come to be. And I saw one interview where they kind of asked that question, and she almost seemed kind of stumped for an answer. And she was saying how it had come from, like, a place of grief, and she needed to do something to put that grief and that feeling into some sort of project, and then this kind of ultimately ended up being birthed from that. But there was a lot of talk about how much of this was that kind of passion project, or coming from a real place of emotion, and how much of it was Warner Brothers pushing that they needed to make another Matrix. So it was almost kind of like she was, like, kind of pressured into this. Because I've never really looked. I mean, I'm sure the story's out there multiple times, but I've never even really necessarily looked into why Lily wasn't involved with this. But it does feel very much like like Warner. Like, you can see the ideas in there that kind of give the idea of the size of the ideas from the original movie and the original concepts. But a lot of it also feels like Warner Brothers just kind of doing their thing. Whereas it's like there's a lot of stuff in here that's pretty almost seems self-congratulatory and certainly self-referential, but there's also the thing where there's being self-referential and there's being self-deprecating, and oftentimes those go together, but sometimes they don't. And here I feel like there's a separation between those two things, and it's one of those cases where you're watching a lot of this and you're just kind of not really sure how to take it. And a lot of that also, I think, has to do with some of these opening scenes where it's just actual recreations of the various scenes that we know and love, which we've seen in stuff like, the later Terminator, like some of the worst Terminator movies. or the worst Terminator movies, like do the whole thing where it's like let's recreate scenes from the original and then play with that. And we get that here too, where it's like we see these new characters, and it's like they're kind of we're basically watching them watch the first movie, but it's clear that a lot of the scenes have been like remade. Um, and they're introducing a lot of the different stuff here, like the new agents, and there's Yahya the second, who is Morpheus now, which when you know that going in that he is Morpheus, kind of makes all this beginning stuff even more confusing. And there's a lot of times where I was asking what Morpheus's purpose even was here, let alone the recasting. That's just there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I wasn't really grasping. And if I were to you come out of the first movie and it's like you know that you've seen something so big and so iconic. You come out of it and you say something like, "Oh, I don't think I was getting all of it." You feel like, "Oh, I need to give these ideas the time of day. I need to go back and I need to really, understand this. Like I want to understand this movie and what is going on, kind of unlock its mysteries." And this one doesn't leave that kind of impact, so it doesn't feel like that. Oh, maybe I just missed stuff. Maybe stuff went over my head or something. It just feels more like it was just really jumbled, and that's why. Like, it wasn't necessarily that we were supposed to feel as confused as we are. A little bit, sure, for the sake of that mystery that we have to, unravel throughout. But for the most part, it just felt like it was the messiness that was causing the mystery. So it was kind of unwanted mystery from both us and the filmmakers. So that's really jumbled also. And then we do have returning actors here with Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Anne Moss, and I think it's no secret that Jada's in this also. In a I don't know how to talk about the Niobe stuff, and I don't know like I said how much people know going in and what we can talk about without going into all the spoilery stuff, because even though I've been doing that a couple of times lately, going into all the spoiler stuff to really dive into it. Once again, I just don't know how worthwhile it is with this one, because I feel like you kind of get the gist of it anyway pretty early on. But one thing here, and I guess this is one kind of a petty thing, but I was having trouble getting past the whole thing of the fact that Thomas Anderson kind of looks like John Wick now, and I know that's kind of, and he eventually gets the shaved head look and stuff like that, but I mean it's like. And I know they're kind of, close together here, John Wick 4 in this, but still, the idea that John Wick has become his own sort of iconic character, it's a bit of a... It almost feels like kind of a cheap thing where it's like... It's almost like The Matrix became the secondary movie where it's like, hey man, we know you're doing John Wick now, we know John Wick's the big thing, but if we could just borrow you, you don't have to change anything, if we could just borrow you. It's like the whole Henry Cavill thing with the mustache all over again, where it's like, you can tell which movie's kind of the bitch and which one's the butch of the two. So this one almost kind of feels like the reject of sorts in regards to Keanu Reeves' sequel projects. And yeah, that's because even when you look at the effects, where it's like, oh, if everything goes wrong with this movie, story-wise, dialogue-wise, acting-wise, whatever, it's a Matrix movie, the effects have to be at the top. Now, you can say that about the first. Obviously, Reloaded has stuff like, all the different Smiths that look really fake and video game-like. Lower-tier video game-like. But here, there are moments where they are great. Like, especially in the big climax, there's a lot of really great effect shots. And especially when there's a lot of stuff happening at once, which can seem really obnoxious, but effects-wise, it works. But then there are other cases where it just doesn't at all, where it looks really fake, or it's an effect that's not... Sometimes it might seem like it's really just overdone and unnecessary, and then also just look like really, fake and almost incomplete. And it's... much like this whole movie, it's just like, okay, I can see what they're doing with this is great, and then there'll be something that comes along, and it's like, oh, this is... I don't know if there's anything in this movie that I hate, or anything like that. It's really just, oh, I could see, what you want to do with this, and what this sets up, and then the stuff that's just underwhelming. And it's like this, and the stuff that feels like should be really, really big, that just kind of feels like it's there. Like I said, where there's a surprising amount of, like, a generic feeling in this, when you just look at other, random sci-fi action movies that are out there. And when you bring in some new faces with old characters, like the fact that we have, who I'm assuming is the Smith that Hugo Weaving played, is Jonathan Groff now, kind of doing something, kind of seeming like, sort of updated thing. And it's one of those cases where you can see what they're doing, and it's a cool idea, and you can imagine a movie where it works. But it's like it's not. It's like it's just not quite getting. It's not like it's a complete dead zone of, oh man, they completely fucked this up. It's just like it's that frustrating feeling of, you can tell it's almost there and it's almost working, but it's not quite getting. It's not like not getting over that last obstacle. It just kind of stalls right when it's getting there, and that's just what a lot of the movie feels like. Idea wise, action scene wise, character wise, all of it is almost there, and just kind of quitting on its way there. And another thing that I think, like character-wise, that's really... Well, here's the thing is, we were talking about the stuff that it almost gets there and then doesn't. There is some stuff, in my opinion anyway, that was kind of DOA anyway, and that even comes from the greatness that is the original movie. And the original movie, which is one of the best, most iconic movies ever. And if there's one problem that I always had, and I still noticed this when I rewatched it in the theater a couple weeks ago, I still had this feeling after all this time, and that was the fact that so much of this story and its outcome is based on this supposed love between Neo and Trinity, specifically the love that Trinity has for him. And I still to this day feels like that kind of came from out of nowhere. And there was really nothing at all that seemed to earn that whatsoever. And the fact that so much is based on it, like the whole fate of everything is based on it, always feels like a reach. And this movie's whole foundation is that. So I don't really... So that in itself was really not kind of... Like, when I realized that was going to be such a big factor of how the pieces of this movie work together goes, I was worried, and I was a little afraid of what the overall quality would be based on that, and it still feels just as unearned as it did before, just sort of as shoehorned as it did before, just as, they feel this way, they have this chemistry because the script says so, because that's what the fate is supposed to be, or some shit like that. I don't know. And that's... If I didn't buy it in the greatness that is the first movie, I'm certainly not going to buy it now. And it's like, and you would think, even with, like, how long Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Anne Moss have known each other, you would think there'd at least be something there in their scenes where it'd be like, okay, I get just enough to where I could just go ahead and run with this. But I don't get any sense of anything in between them. It's just, I don't know. Yeah, and then there's all the stuff where, like I said, it really gets into the whole, essentially talking to the audience, sometimes chastising the audience. There's the Lambert Wilson character comes back for, like, one scene, and you've heard of things being on the nose, but, like, there's on the nose, and then there's this that's so many levels above being on the nose, that is literally just telling the audience exactly how it feels. And I get the sense where there's maybe supposed to be some sort of satirical element here, but it's just also, it's way too blatant pretty much any time it's going about that. Yeah, so, and it's like, that's the thing too, is it's like, there are moments, and because the original movie, of course, is full of exposition, but it still has so many ideas in it, that, like, it could still explain stuff to you all day, but there's still ideas at the end that you can run with yourself, and many people have practically built a fucking religion in regards to the concepts that are in the original movie, still. Like there are people that, like, genuinely believe the whole simulation thing in a really weird way, and what can you really take away from this that's going to do that? There's not really anything. It's just literally telling you just pretty much everything, like how to feel and exactly what it is, and not really giving you any ideas to take with you. It's just there. And Yeah, and then I guess the one person I didn't mention was Neil Patrick Harris, who I was really interested to be in a movie like this. And I honestly just really couldn't get away from. But I don't usually typically have this problem, but I just kind of couldn't get away from the fact that it was Neil Patrick Harris. Like even in like the later scenes when he becomes more crucial, it was just like I was just constantly acknowledging the fact that like it's interesting that Neil Patrick Harris is in this. Like I wasn't even hardly paying attention to what he said. He was saying some really crucial shit too, and I was like half paying attention because the other half of my brain was saying like Neil Patrick Harris is here. That's interesting. So that's as far as I could really take that. If there's one thing about this movie that I could say I hate, it'd probably just be the fact that there's like friendly sentinels now is really weird and stupid. And it's like you kind of fell into like a kids movie for a split second with the sentinels of all things. Like of all the things that you could make, like I said, like they're from some kid friendly movie or something. That was a fucked up idea. That has a studio came up with this all over it. So like I said, it's hard to put a lot of this on Wachowski because it feels so much like a studio did a lot of what the problems are. And how they almost kind of thought that they might have been like acknowledging a lot of the stuff that people have called them out for. And you could with the new Space Jam too, they were kind of like they were trying to really be in with the audience and say, hey, we know what we are and stuff like that. But it just kind of ends up having the opposite effect in both of these cases. Not to say that this is Space Jam 2 levels of bad or anything. It's not. And I wasn't miserable watching it either. Like that, I guess that's one important thing. Is it's like I wasn't necessarily saying, "Oh God, I can't wait for this to end." I know that sets the bar about as low as it can go, but sometimes, sometimes if you can actually get through a movie, it almost feels like enough of a positive to say, to mention. So, um, I don't, I don't know. I don't know if I'm like. Well, that's the thing is I've never felt really passionate about any of these except for the first one. So I didn't really have too many expectations even going into it, especially being a long delay sequel, which we know is more often than not a kiss of death. But it was interesting and like the ideas, especially at the beginning, were interesting enough and involving enough that I was compelled in some way. But it's yeah, in retrospect, obviously, there's so much to be desired, and that's not even necessarily holding it up to the first movie and saying, "Oh, you must be of this quality," because that was never going to happen. But it's to give you just a little something to leave with. But I don't. I think when I finished this, I just barely thought about it the rest of the day. Interestingly enough, I was thinking more about Kingsman, which is really weird. So, with that segue, let's go into Kingsman. Which is the King's Man, which is the sort of prequel franchise potentially they seem to try to be setting up. But I guess there is going to be a third one that continues to follow the Taron Egerton story. That's supposedly starting production in like next year or 2023, one of the two. Yeah, but that's the thing about this movie is as far as this being a prequel set in like the World War I era, where we have Ralph Fiennes kind of at the head of this, and we realize that the whole concept is that we're gonna kind of see the birth of Kingsman as we know it in the earlier movies that we know about, later in the timeline, earlier in actual time, not confusing at all. And we're bringing in a lot of like historical villains into this, and so you immediately think this concept with the whole Kingsman thing sounds like a really cool idea, and it's like this could open up its whole other thing that like where it has the Kingsman vibe, but it's like a totally different thing in a totally different setting with totally different kinds of characters. This could be really fun. I guess what's interesting about this movie is that there was a good 45 minutes or so where I basically come to the conclusion that I didn't like it. But lucky for it, it is 2 hours and 11 minutes. So it had time. Usually, by like the 45-minute mark, if I'm done with a movie, I'm done with a movie, probably. More often than not. It'll take a lot to kind of bring it back around, and it's like, okay, now I get what's going on, and I kind of get it. I had seen that the reviews for this were not stellar, and a lot of people kind of weren't taking to it, and I can see why. But because like to talk about why I wasn't into it for that first 45 minutes or so, it just felt like a lot of setup. It just kept like it was going and going and going, and it felt like we were like halfway through the movie, and it's like they're still just setting stuff up. It's like, is something going to happen at some point? But and like we introduce a whole bunch of villains, but then like we barely acknowledge those villains for a long time. So it's like there's a lot of characters in there. It's like, are they going to be in this story? Like, what is going on? Where you kind of get the idea of it's like going to be almost video game like, where it's one low tier villain, and then they kind of get more threatening as they go on, and the stakes get higher as the villains go on, and they're gonna have to go through them. But it's just kind of a couple of the villains at this table because once again we're setting up what is apparently supposed to be a separate sort of like prequel franchise for Kingsman. But on top of that, also on top of it just feeling like endless setup with like not a lot of a target to reach. The dialogue also was kind of annoying, where like basically everybody was speaking in like old sayings and cliches. But it was like the whole dialogue. Like every time somebody said something to another character or responded, it was with some cliche or something, and that wasn't great. But then there's also the whole idea, and this was one criticism that I actually heard about before I went into it, and that was the fact that it doesn't feel like a Kingsman movie in the first half, and I could get that vibe also because it's not that it has to necessarily be, super flashy constantly, but you do get this. Kingsman had a certain vibe from the word go when the first one came out in 2015, and like immediately set the precedent for what we were to expect out of this. And it's the reason people love those movies, at least the first one. Yeah, it felt very dry and kind of dull for a Kingsman movie. And you can take into account that we're technically setting up how we got to that point, so that might take a little slowness. But like I was saying, it feels a lot like we're getting bombarded with setup, and that can get really tiresome. And so eventually it does reach a point. You can tell. You can absolutely 100% tell the moment it becomes a Kingsman movie. And then from then on, it was like, okay. Well, here's the thing, though, and here's another reason that I think people aren't taking to it is it might seem tonally off. Which, you go into a Kingsman movie, it's probably not surprising to hear that. Even though the first one had a lot of different tones, it managed to juggle them relatively well and hit the marks right. But about this one kind of being tonally off, it's not necessarily just the fact of, oh, it feels like one thing, then it feels like another. It's like this movie is three different movies entirely. Because we get the moment where it's a whole lot of setup for a very long time, and then there's the scene. It's one particular scene where it's like, oh yes, this is definitely a Kingsman movie. Okay, now we're in it. But then once that scene happens and we get prepared, it's like, oh, it's a Kingsman movie now. It turns into something else completely. It turns basically into what felt like watching 1917 again, where it becomes a war movie, and that was jarring. And it was like, okay, so it's this now, and then like it's so jarring that like you could be watching the middle portion of the movie for a whole 10 or 15 minutes where you're not even thinking about anything but the movie, and then suddenly it hits you. Wait, this is a Kingsman movie, right? It's like I almost forgot what movie I was even watching. What is this now? And then that portion reaches to a certain point, but that's the thing. And then we kind of go into what is essentially the third act and the climax, and then it's kind of a Kingsman movie again. But then it's like that can be really off-putting. But for me, the reason it was working was because I guess the thing I should mention is I saw this like a couple of days ago, so it's actually had time to like sit in my mind before talking about it now, and that has helped it a lot, because it's the thing where like when it becomes a Kingsman movie nearly an hour in, probably about an hour in, I was able to say, okay, now I see what all the build up for was for and what all we were leading to. It's like, now that I see what we're leading to, okay, I get it now. And I had that same feeling after the second portion also, where it's like, what the fuck is this? This is a war movie. This is not a Kingsman movie at all. I literally feel like I'm watching 1917 again. And then when it reaches its point, I was able to look back on all of it and think, like, oh, that's what they were doing. That's the point. We were supposed to get to this point through that. And then, so it's that kind of in retrospect where I was, like, starting to piece it together and realize, like, why we were seeing things at the times we were seeing them and for how... That might still be a reasonable complaint, is, like, how long it takes to get to these points to where you have enough time to forget the movie that you're watching, even. And like I said, I can totally see that being off-putting to an audience. And like if somebody was to say, no, it jumped around way too much, it was so tonally off, and I just was not into it, I would totally buy it. Like I said, for the first 45 minutes, I wasn't into this really at all. Like I said, I was pretty much convinced that I didn't like this movie. But I don't know, just the way those payoffs eventually came started kind of reshaping the movie for me in retrospect, as I was still watching it. And so when I came out of it, I was like, I can see where it's the puzzle pieces are really hard to fit together, but they do, to me anyway, and I feel like they do enough that I eventually left satisfied by the end of it. So that's the thing where it's like, it's because one problem that it does have, I guess you could say, is that it's lacking like the comedic nature. Like the one character in this that absolutely feels like they're in a Kingsman movie from beginning to end is Rhys Ifans playing Rasputin, and Fiennes, has those moments where like you can sense that he's supposed to kind of be like the Colin Firth of this story, but Colin Firth still had like that charm to it where you could tell it was almost like where there was almost like he was almost comedic in the way he did it, even though his character was like so by the book serious and stuff like that. But there was still like that charm to him in that way, like a lightness to the character, even though he was also incredibly violent. And that's the kind of thing that's kind of missing here, like that sort of balance between how there's almost a glee and a lightness to just how violently graphic the movies are, which is what the first one found so well. And this one, like I said, this one is pretty stone-faced about itself for a lot of the time, and I feel like that's something else that might be pretty off-putting going into a Kingsman movie, but so I don't know, somehow against all odds, I was kind of, it was starting to win me over, because you got stuff also where, like, Rasputin looks like a genuinely threatening villain, but yet he's seen as, like, sort of lower tier throughout it, and then, like, even when he walks into the party, and he glides in, and I was thinking in my head, like, whoa, that's intimidating, and then as soon as he gets to Fiennes, they just start clowning him for gliding in. And it's like, I think that's the kind of thing that I think people might be more here for, as far as like the balance between the action and then stuff like this, while having a serious beat every now and then that comes through. But yeah, it's pretty, like I said, it's pretty straight-faced about itself for most of the time, with those comedic moments just kind of sneaking in every now and then, or those over-the-top moments sneaking in every now and then. But it does get progressively more over the top once it gets to its climax, is when it really becomes like what Kingsman to be. And for a lot of people that might be too little too late, and I would totally get that. Like I was saying, I don't know, just as far as these like being... I could also see people saying, like, yeah, they work as standalone scenes, but trying to put them together is an absolute mess. But, like I said, even though I get it, somehow it pieced together just enough for me that I felt like it worked and I felt satisfied. So, and I think another thing is, like, it feels genuinely epic. Like, I can see a lot of people saying it feels way too long, and I had said there's certainly moments in the middle here where you can stretch these to get to the point a little quicker than they do. But at the end of the day, after everything that's happened in this movie has happened, it feels practically epic. Like, so much has happened, and gotten us to this point. And as far as, like, setting up a whole franchise that we've come to know in these later movies, or later movies, whatever you want to say, that feels appropriate. But the fact that, like, it's still just we still get so much sequel bait. For this particular franchise. And it's like you can see where all that setup was coming from, so it's like, if they get to do later movies, maybe all this setup will feel worth it, but for now, it does feel a bit like overkill in the early portions of the movie, that it feels like too much setup. But overall, it just somehow worked for me, but I'm understanding that I might be in a bit of a minority on that, and that's okay, because I get it. And as far as like, plays, obviously it's not as good as the first, which is amazing, but I do think this one is better than the second one. And depending on who you ask, that might be a low bar, but I was okay with the second one. There's a lot of stuff in the second one that I really like, and there's a lot of stuff that I could have really done without. And it definitely could have been cut down for sure. But this one I think is a pretty big step above. I feel much more satisfied by this one than I did the Golden Circle, but the first one, of course, naturally is still on top. So, to the surprise of nobody, I'm sure. So, that's where I stand with those two. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a couple of potential awards movies with Don't Look Up and Being the Ricardos. So maybe that'll be fun, maybe it won't be, I don't know. So until then, I think that's it.